All right, welcome everyone at the Multi-Network Community Sync. Today is September 27th. We have a few items on the agenda. The first thing, I ran the doc, our initial discussion of that with Tim Hawkin, and have some initial feedback from him on that. So let me maybe go through the doc and I left some comments in it so that I remember I shared this guy. So the main feedback is keep it simple. Don't make it too complex. And the concern here is around who, in case us is going to move on from other things outside of the multi-networking, who's going to be the person that's going to be able to understand this and drive it. So basically, how to ensure that whatever we add to the core can be then maintained in the future by the community in general, not only the few of us in this meeting. So the general kind of feedback is to ensure that whatever we add is very simple and it's not complex. Or we have to have a really good argumentation behind it, right? That's kind of the main gist of the discussion. So in that note, the first thing was said about the additional, I think, the pod network attachment, and maybe let me start from that, is in the conception of itself is quite simple, but why would we need it, right? What is the use case for having this additional pod network attachment, right? So I try to create kind of come up with use cases where we want to use it and how, and it's something that I think I would need as well help from this group to argument a little better than what I currently have, even in the doc and then everywhere else. So I'm seeking for help from here to kind of start looking, and if you could look at the doc where I'm describing this object and why we need it, even here in this beginning, to read through it and help me enhance it. As this stand, this might be hard bullet to sell. To add this additional object into the core together with pod network. So that's one thing that I'm asking this group as well to kind of review this doc in sections where we mentioned the pod network attachment and help me argument its existence better, because as it stands, we might be having a hard time selling this and pushing it through. So that's one comment. The other comment was about the IPAM stuff that basically I think I've been mostly pushing. As we said below, that the Kubernetes type of IPAM, then this is the node IPAM that would be there, will not be implemented by this KEP. Team put a question into why then having those fields at all then. If we don't support them, we basically mostly going to use external. And then the non-type, is this a valid use case for us to have it here as an additional option? Because we mostly would use the non-type, the ability to not specify an IP for the radio connect, as we call it with team, the radio use case, basically SROV with VFIO, right? Is that popular enough use case in Kubernetes globally? And I know within this group, it's like one of the main use cases, but now think about this globally across Kubernetes. What percentage of users would you really use this, right? And then whether that entitles to have this field. If we were to remove this, then and Kubernetes is not implemented, and the other feedback was to don't introduce something that maybe sometimes in the future is going to be implemented. If that's the case, then let's add it with that cap. So basically, definitely just remove the Kubernetes element. Questions about non-type. So then we end up with just one item. What's the point of then keeping, at least at this stage, those two fields, right? And the current proposal is to get rid of this and keep it simple. Ensure we just always do external IPAM. And then on the other hand, we need to think about what to do with the non-type. So this is something that was another feedback on this, considering that we don't implement the Kubernetes piece option, something that probably would come in later phase. And when we do that, then probably we can revisit this, adding that field into this this object. But currently, in the sense of keeping it simple, just maybe we can remove that. Any comments on that?
I think that sounds sensible in the short term. I think it'll let us move forward. Sounds like it will get rid of an objection, and we can come back to it in a later version.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so there is that. The next item was the list of the parameters ref. It's unusual. Maybe that was the comment. It's not that it's a bad thing, but nobody really does this. And why would you want to have this? The main concern was with user experience. And in this sense, what if, where do I have this one right here? Because then we are assuming the implementation handles a list, right? Ensures there is enough elements of it, what type of the elements. That means we put a little more pressure on the implementation to ensure this list is valid, right? Because that's the consequence of having a list, right? Is that okay, right? So this is.
I'm just trying to understand the so it's it puts pressure on the implementation.
Yes.
Do you think to make
because
sure that that's valid?
Imagine now my implementation. I just use this one parameters, right? This only object that this parameters, this parameter CRT that I created, and only that one, right? Okay, so you have to reference then. This is a list. So now, what if you provide two of them? What if you provide something else than my object? So this is the pressure I'm referring to, where that implementation, if they want to be really robust, they would have to ensure that this list lists only one element and always mine, right? So that's what UX we are referring to towards, right? And then on the other hand, usually this field, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, but if we want to keep it, let's have a argumentation around this, right? Because that is a case, right, where we put pressure on implementation to ensure that when you add this, ensure that now you cover all the corner cases, right? Where there can be multiple of those, there can be different types. So ensure you have a webhook or what's not to kind of limit this. Otherwise, you open users to failure in some ways, or confusion, right? Because someone created, I listed all those, and I saw someone else was doing this and it worked for them. Why doesn't work it here? And then, because this implementation doesn't support it or something, right? So that was basically the feedback, right? We probably, because this is something that will be fully owned by the implementation, right? This field is not, the core won't touch it, right? So that's the feedback, right?
Isn't there a similar argument about having a custom reference anyway? Because the custom reference is going to point to some thing that's defined by a CRD, and you could put in something that is just not understood by an implementation anyway. So the implementation is going to have to do some firewalling. That's
true. I agree with you, right? But then it's just one object, right? And this is maybe this is niche, and maybe team is exaggerating, right? Maybe that's not a big deal, right? And I'm just trying to pass the feedback. You're right that at least you have to validate, is that the object that you support, the type of it, right? But then that's the only check. The other check, then you have to specify that this is not a list, that doesn't have more elements than what you support. Or if you do support multiple, then ensure that they are the right type. I think, yeah, that's something that basically does the pressure that we would put on the implementation to have that. And maybe that's negligible, so it's not a big deal. So I think someone else had some comment.
Just to be clear, Mache, I totally understand that you're bringing the feedback to us, not that you're necessarily taking the same position. And yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what we can do to simplify because that feedback, the initial feedback, like we got to keep it simple. I think that's really good. So I mean, at least from my standpoint, which is okay, so in a pod network, having the parameter refs, it to me makes a lot of sense from coming from the Multus standpoint, where I'm like, I have an existing CRD and I kind of want to group these together. So it is I could live. I think that I could live with this being a single item. Is that the feedback, that it should be a single item and not a list?
Maybe maybe the feedback would be, as I mentioned before, right? It just adds complexity. And I even wrote, maybe add examples in the appendix, right? Maybe how this would be used. Maybe I need more better argumentation behind it to have it, right? Because it wasn't like, oh, let's not. No. It can be there, but let's maybe have better argumentation behind it to introduce it. That's one piece, and the other piece would be to maybe the one problem with this will be the UX, right? But I think let's just maybe I would keep it as is. It just maybe help me with better, maybe just add use cases of what I come up with here. I came with the use case where basically want to reference multiple, but maybe I need some help on providing the use case, right? An example of how this would be used, and that's it. Michael?
You actually hit on just what I was going to say, that, if we have valid use cases that, say 75% of the community wants this to say this, and in particular, just as an example, that they want this to be, a slice or an array, we should push for that. Just saying that it's too complex, kind of that argument falls short if we actually have the quantitative evidence to back it that people want it. So that's the right thing. You hit the nail on the head when you said it.
Yeah, and you hit the nail here as well, Michael, because that was as well feedback, right? Let's have because maybe I couldn't sell it right in terms of use cases. So help me with defining the use cases here, because it wasn't like a complete no, right? Because that's not the case. It's just a matter of let's have a better use cases defined, that let's have our better argumentation for it. That's it.
Yeah, 100%. And can I just to set the stage here, were you using that presentation as well on top of going through the KEP, or were you just going through the KEP?
I was going through the doc. No, the presentation that I have there, we're gonna go to it. I don't want to go over it. I just want to mention that it's there today. But I want to go over it tomorrow at the SIG networking. So definitely that's something that I'm creating to kind of show to the SIG network first, and then the other SIGs later down the road. So that's my kind of role. But I don't want to kind of I will get there in a second. Does this sound good? Then let's have some better arguments and better examples for this one, right?
I think for me, I agree. We should work on the examples probably, right, to justify because there's multiple ways on the implementation that you can use it. One is, do you support it? But You could also say, okay, someone referenced it, and I ignore the parameters that I don't support, and I give a warning or something. I do agree that there's more work in the implementation, but this gives more flexibility, right? Which is that's the trade-off.
Yeah,
and if it's purely the implementation itself, then I would say, okay, if we have good use cases for it, I think we should be able to argument around it.
All right. All right, let's move on then. Conditions the same. The in-use flag, Tim brought up a case for race, that this flag will never, cannot be 100% trusted. And the example would be if, because we have the dependency on the other, no, this is in use for pods, right? So basically, I am referencing do you exist? Are you used? Sorry, apologies. So I would check this flag whether you exist or not. But what if in the same time a pod is being created, right? So there might be a race, because this is not sequential. There might be a race where basically this will be a lie, right? In terms of, oh, this flag is not there, but pods is about to be created and getting ready, right? So that's why there will be races. And instead of just doing this, the proposal is just to your other components would look at, if they need to see whether there are pods using it, just do the check, right? Just do the listing and do that check yourself. So I'm thinking of that's kind of true, because we will never be, what I want to say, this is racy, the in-use flag, and it will not be 100% valid to trust, because you might check it, but then you might run into a case where it's not really true, and then you would have to do your check again because it's flaky, right? And flakiness, that's something that we should not introduce. So the proposal is to get rid of it, and then if you want to check if a thing is in use, then do the check yourself. And this will be as well, so the functionality will still be there that this flag was introducing, and what I mean by that is this object will have a finalizer, and basically the finalizer will only be removed when there are no pods using it. That aspect will not change, and it will be still there. But the thing here, the indicator will not, because it's not 100% reflective of what's really happening. So that's the feedback on this one. I think this is kind of straightforward, and I think this is not a big deal. Any other comments? Wim, you have a hand, or does it from previous?
It's stale. Sorry, I'll.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, no worries. Yeah. So that's this one. And is there anything else? Let me see. I think that was I think this is where we got in the doc. We had a shorter meeting, and we didn't went through 100% of it, but I think that's the gist of the feedback that I have. I think the one major one would be about the existence of pod network, because that's something that we did talk through as well. As I mentioned on the beginning, so I need better argumentation for it. Tim was mentioning maybe instead of using this object, what if, and that's something I think we even were thinking, what if we were to propose here a reference to custom object inside the pod spec directly, instead of having this indirection, right? That was maybe some idea that he was thinking to maybe do instead. But I think this one is cleaner, that the indirection is better, because then you really have a clear object that are core that you don't have to kind of deal with. So I prefer this approach. So let's try. What I want to do is I want to go with this in the CAP, in the PR, but I need your help in terms of argumentation of the need for the pod network attachment, because that's another thing, right? If we want to have it, when you describe it on a paper, maybe the picture maybe at top is a bit confusing here with this list of kind of dependencies and how and who can and how many times can reference it. Maybe that's too confusing. But still, when you just simplify that, how it references and how it works, it's just basically 3 objects that they can reference each other. And basically that's it, where it ends. So maybe I need help from you on getting better argumentation on why to keep the pod network attachment. I do want to have it as well. So let's work on better argumentation of why we would need that pod network attachment. And this is basically AI to you folks as well to help me with reviewing this pieces. I think this is the beginning of here, and then the top section where I'm trying to kind of put arguments what the pod network attachment is. I did it as well on the presentation there, so that could help me about this one as well. So I think that's the gist of the comments here. Any other comments from you? If not, then let's move on. So the next thing was the I've kicked off the presentation for. Let me just maybe share this. This is the slides I created for the SIGs kind of for the SIGs, right? So I want to go and say that we want to introduce this, define more or less what we are doing, where we are, what sort of use cases we want to cover, what objects we want to introduce, what changes in this first phase, right? So please review this. I'm gonna have probably at least initial feedback tomorrow. I'm planning to refine this today, and then we're gonna present this. I want to present this tomorrow. I have an agenda item for tomorrow's SIG networking meeting to present this. So that will give us initial feedback from the team, what they think about the whole idea, not generally about the presentation itself, but about the general idea. So then I can probably further refine this, but then we can see what how the community feels about our plans in general anyway. Please review this if you could. If there's anything, other items I'm missing that I should have here, please let me know. I will add that. So there is this guy. Any other comments or questions on this?
Is this presentation also going to double for KubeCon?
No. We are
Okay.
working with Doug on that one separately. No, this is maybe we're gonna pull something from here. I'm not sure. We'll see with Doug what's valid, what's not. But no, this is just this might be some source for something. I'm gonna maybe refine this even further. No, but this is just for SIGs. This is because the difference between the KubeCon and here, I want to go for the SIGs. I want to go in more into details, and this is just strictly kind of targeted towards the implementation of what we want to do, what we want to change, right? And this is not, I think, discussion for KubeCon. What's going to change as much, right? At least in that level of details. Okay. Share this tab. Circle back. I think, Philip, that's you.
Yes, that's me. Thank you. So, so I would have liked to have prepared more. This is the first, I spoke with you guys a couple months ago. This is the first meeting that I've been able to attend since then, because the times have all been wrong. But you know, we are working with the Gateway API group, and I think it would be good for us to coordinate how we look at multiple networks, both inside the cluster and outside, and how it interacts with the Gateway API. And I have some thoughts on it that I'd like to share and get some feedback. So can I share for a second?
Oh yeah, let me just stop share more. I will make you just co-host. There you go.
So I would have liked to generalize this drawing a little bit more, but I think it helps to kind of illustrate sort of the issue. So we have a product called SPK, which is really a gateway. It's a path in and out of Kubernetes. And one of the things that we're trying to solve and that we've identified, particularly for telcos, but also for other types of users, is that the ingress path and the egress path for data is completely separate in Kubernetes. And that causes a lot of problems. And so, we are actively trying to work on having this gateway API be a path in and out of Kubernetes, sort of a unified path, so that you can then also apply, different kinds of policies, firewalls, application firewalls, whatever else on top of that, source network address translation, whatever kinds of policies you need. And one of the issues is that in this environment, there are multiple external network domains that are intentionally segmented. They are intentionally kept separate. So here I've shown, sort of highlighted what I call a services network, which is where there are a bunch of service-based communications that are HTTP services defined by, that are used for setting up 5G calls. And you have traffic between consumers and producers, essentially clients and servers for doing 5G. But you have all these other external networks over on the left. You have like operations administration and maintenance, a radio access network, et cetera. And so having this gateway able to connect to multiple networks is useful. While talking to customers, they are also asking about having multiple internal networks, multiple pod networks, right? And I didn't add this to the drawing, but essentially, I think it's some of the use cases that you just had up on those slides, right? Like having a separate, VLAN for control plane, having separate VLANs to isolate different vendor applications from each other, so that you could have a pod or an overlay network that would connect, say, the pods inside of the consumer or producer, or maybe with other, vendor applications, but would be more isolated from the other applications in the network. And so what I'm suggesting is that there are sort of two multi-network aspects. There's having multiple external networks, which I represent here with the services network, IMS, OAM, and RAN. And then there's having multiple internal networks, right, connecting pods. And the proposal for the gateway API for egress, so that we can sort of create a single data path in and out of Kubernetes, is to have the gateway, to have gateways when the gateway class is installed by the infrastructure provider, that they would configure what external networks there are. And then the gateways themselves would be gateways to a single external network. And then application developers would request routes against those gateways. And this is sort of how you would control the traffic in and out, north-south. And I'm wondering how this aligns with, and maybe the gateways themselves would leverage some of the multi-network stuff that you guys are working on to configure what external networks look like. And then CNIs would use the sort of internal networks to create different pod and overlay networks. And I'm wondering what your take is on that.
So keep in mind that the name is pod network, right? So wherever we define here is for the pods. We shouldn't be creating a pod network object for something that's external, and then pod should not that pod will never attach to. That's not the point of the pod network, right? So
Correct.
on that manner, I don't think we can describe what's external to your in your infrastructure, right? So that's something that this definitely doesn't fit. The one thing that I do like about what you're showing here is the single network. I think this is where recently we have Dave Protasowski came here. I'm not sure he's working with gateway routability as well. I'm not sure you saw that proposal, but he was talking about private public gateway, right? He wants to kind of provide that kind of aspect, and some of the folks in the gateway discussion kind of tell them, "Oh, go to multi-network because that sounds somehow similar." And basically, what we are stating is what you have it in the middle, right? The single network. This is what we are trying to kind of settle, and maybe that's gonna change, but I think because we are not at this point of our designs on how we really want to kind of support services, gateways, ingress, what's not. But I think the kind of the vision for that, at least mine, would be that gateway belongs to a network. What I want to ensure that gateway is not a router. All right. It's not
Right.
a gateway doesn't route between multiple networks and you can pick and choose. No, gateway is assigned to a network, and gateway is a gateway within that network. If we keep it in that terms, this is very simple because we just keep the same functionality what we have for gateway today, but in different VLANs, right? So I want to attract traffic to this gateway, do something about it in that different VLAN, right? Or as you showed, in a gateway class, right? So this is something that where you gateway class assigning to an external network doesn't kind of work for me, because unless it can be the same, and think about it, Philip, because maybe that can be the same where if I indicate in gateway class to a specific VLAN and basically all pods connect to that VLAN, can the internal external be the same? That's the question to you, right? I don't have to answer now, maybe, but think about that, right? Does it really have to be? Because otherwise, if it is the different, then you make a gateway a router, right? You route the external to internal, which I don't think we would want to introduce routing into. We want to keep it simple to ensure this is just networks that provides you like isolation similar to namespaces, right?
But
do you see my point here,
I think some level of routing is necessary if you're going to have a pod network that is separate from your external networks.
And what we want to say is that's up to you whether you interconnect that network with some other networks, with your default, for example. And that's everything is done externally, and it's up to you. What we ensure is we want to be so today. The main rule of thumb. Sorry, Doug. Let me. I will give you voice. Give me a sec. The rule of thumb for today's network, the default network, is all the pods have connectivity within the cluster. All right. Assuming we have only one network, and that works, right? When we start introducing additional networks, let's just do the same. All the pods within that network has to have connectivity. This is one of our requirements, right? And we just want to keep it that level simple. We don't want to introduce capability of routing, because that just basically brings up OpenStack back here, and that's just too complex. We don't want to do that. And I'm bringing up OpenStack because OpenStack had the full kind of configurability, right? So this is something that I would push back on. Doug, you had a hand for long. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I understand it a little bit better from what Maciej is talking about with the gateway not being a router. But yeah, it's to me, and Philip, correct me if I'm wrong, but what this sounds like is that it's a way to kind of orchestrate what the attachment to a network will be at more of this like cluster admin infrastructure provider level, so that you could say like this class of pods connects via this infrastructure provider network. Does that match with what you're trying to do? I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you go back to this drawing, there are certain applications that can connect to the services network. There are certain applications that can connect to the RAN network. There are certain applications that can connect to the IMS network. And so, and the control for that is these guys up here, not the application.
All right. Okay, that's
right?
helpful, and I get it. And so I guess one thing that I would say is, I think that this is interesting and compelling. But one of my experiences with the group, the network plumbing working group that came up with network attachment definition was one of the major challenges that we kind of tabled early on was to answer the question of which network you're attached to. So I think that this is compelling in terms of adding some semantics to say like, okay, we know something about you as a pod or a group of pods, and we're going to connect you to this particular network. I would say that from the pod network object, I wouldn't necessarily want to say that we want to define it there, but if it was somehow knitted together from an implementation viewpoint, I think that would be very good. And then also additionally on the note of routing, this has traditionally also been kind of a challenge with network attachment definition, and the way that it's typically implemented with a Meta plugin is that routing is a challenge, and it often requires a little bit more of like babying, like that you've got to specifically set your routes or use something like that, like one particular solution from a like Meta plugin standpoint would be to use something that overrides your routes and you set them statically. But I also think that this would be interesting from an implementation standpoint, where if you have some type of orchestration that is smarter about this, like a gateway class, gateway level, like you're representing here, to be able to say have that control over the pods to say like, hey, your routing is going this way, or this is the gateway that you're using, and to have your implementation handle that is also interesting. But similar to my last comment, I'm not particularly sure that I think that some of the things that we've sort of addressed here, at least in our use cases, like for example, like the idea of like dynamic attachments or like a hot plug functionality. I mean, you could kind of read that as like an opportunity to like modify the like networking properties of a given interface or pod network attachment to a pod. I think could be good implementation wise, but I'm not sure that at this phase of the game that in our like API specification that we're looking at, that we'd want to necessarily say like hey, do we want to tackle the like difficulty that is the routing here? But implementation wise, it's interesting. That's my 2 cents, and thanks for letting me blattle.
So
Yeah,
what I would add to this is, let's remember this is ingress and egress. So this is basically just the, kind of let's call it steering of the traffic right within Gluster. It's not about physical connectivity to a pod. What I'm kind of saying what the gateway here functions as here. And Philip, I think this would work, the gateway class side, it's something that basically your implementation handles in full. It can be somehow standardized, but this will be something separate to what we are doing here, because what I would want you to definitely to preserve, and if we could kind of agree on that gateway belongs to a network, internal network, right? So basically I can route those and attract those traffic ingress or egress only within the specific pod network, right? And then how, and then the gateway class itself can then indicate what is the external stuff, but that can be completely implementation specific. But since it's external, and you don't have to do anything special for, maybe you would because of what Doug said in terms of those routes, extra routes, if anything. So maybe you would have to, your implementation of the pod network itself, first the internal network would have to support how I then, if I have this gateway class from external going to this internal guy, I maybe have to tweak some routes on that internal pod network to ensure that the traffic can return, right, and be replied. That's something that you would have to kind of combine the two. So this is where I think would be one of the problems. But if we keep the pod network as a part of the gateway and a service, right, where basically gateway is within the specific internal, as you called it, networks, I think then we could coexist, right? Because the external piece is kind of implementation specific. The gateway class kind of attached to external things, and how it's being implemented, that's completely outside of CNI scope, right? Because this is, keep in mind, we are looking at pod network means an identification of what I'm doing on the CNI level, on the pod level, attached to physically, right, to the pod. And you're not in that business. You're going into a business into how do I do an ingress, attract the traffic into the cluster, right? From where to where, right? That's what you want to achieve. Isn't that correct?
Well, and how it goes out. This is the primary, to me, the primary failing of Kubernetes networking is that ingress and egress are handled completely separately and don't have any unified controls. Right? Because it means that you have to treat each Kubernetes level service kind of separately versus treating an application together. Right.
Yeah, I hear you. So I think in that terms, that still should be fine, right? Because this still would be contained to a specific network, right? So basically, because imagine a situation where you have pod there can be pod in one of the two cases, right? Either pod has multiple interfaces, or pod has just one interface, but in a one non-default network, right? Well, and basically, and basically, then if you want to, let's say the case where you have a single interface in a pod, but it's a non-default network, right? That gateway now, if you want to touch and put ingress into that pod or capture an egress from that pod, you have to select the specific interface of that pod, right? So basically, you need to select that non-default pod network to which I apply, and then I have at least the internal piece covered, right? But now the question would be, what do I allow, and how do I now marry that part, the pod internal, how I configure the pod network, with the gateway class that says you have to connect to this external network X, right? How do I do that? How do I ensure that what I want to say, that the traffic going out from that pod can properly reach out to that external network, right? You see, so this in terms of like physical connection to the CNI part, you might not need to do much, but then you need to do something about the routes inside the pod, or some additional whatever you use to kind of to direct the traffic.
Yeah, and this is the thing. Like right now, our product, our implementation, is dealing with pods with a single interface, right? And we are just releasing what I call multis capture, which is a fancy way of saying if you're if you also are using Multus to do like a MAC VLAN or IPVLAN type interface, we can redirect that traffic also through the gateway, right? So you can apply, again, consistent policies for ingress and egress traffic, even if somebody's using like MAC VLAN or something, right? With the work you guys are doing, there could be a whole bunch of pod networks.
Right.
Right. And I guess the question is, if somebody is egressing, like if somebody's going to, ordinarily in a pod, you just say, hey, I'm going to this destination, right? And how are you dealing with, if you have, say, 3 pod overlays, 3 pod networks connected to that, which interface or how that packet leaves to the external point is, I guess, my question.
So this would be based on if because I think you're referring to the first use case that I was pointing out, where I have multiple interfaces inside the pod.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that case, it's up to implementation how that's routed, how that's configured. I did in my CAP. I do want to kind of indicate through some flags a notion of a default interface within the nodes, right? And that's depending on how you implement your CNIs, because on the other hand, some CNIs will dictate that for you. You cannot control it. That's hard coded in the CNI conf stated where, okay, this CNI configuration is the default. So basically you cannot pick and choose. But I want to kind of have an implementation where I can pick and choose. I have multiple pod networks with the same level of capabilities. Each one of them can be default, and I want to pick and choose, right? For this pod, second network is going to be the default. For the other pod, the third one will be the default, right? So I want to pick and choose. So we have the capability to indicate which one is the default, and that will boil down to some sort of implementation that will say, okay, for this pod, this guy is the default gateway. Or you want to do something else. You want to create an SBR, for example, right? Or leverage SBR. So you just want to exit for that pod when the traffic comes from that pod, from that interface, right? So you just deal with the replies. And it's basically in this case, Philip, to answer your question, it boils down to the implementation. That's what I want to kind of get to. It's not something that we impose. So many implementations. We talked about a network. Network can be so many, and you can see on my CAP, I don't want to kind of put any definition on what a network is in context of Kubernetes, because everyone has their own opinion and their own circumstances on what a network for their case is, right? So that's why it will boil down to how the implementation does it and what they kind of consider as a network, right? And then based on that, how the implementation handles like when multiple interfaces, how they deal with routes and what's not, right? Or they do something else. So to answer your questions, we don't specify that, and it's up to the implementation on how they handle the multiple interfaces, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to summarize, this group is really looking only at multiple pod networks, not multiple networks more generally, like external networks.
Yes, we want to describe
the
pod networks. Yeah.
You don't have you're not defined if a CNI has multiple interfaces, is using multiple pod networks. There isn't a specification. There isn't a requirement for how egressing traffic specifically would flow in terms of between those. And while I think I heard general approval of having this gateway concept of having a separate gateway for each external network, it doesn't necessarily touch on the work that you guys are doing.
If we were keep it as a external and you don't touch on the internal stuff, how that's going to behave, then we are good. Yes, I don't think that we are in any collision path.
So what about just pure ingress?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, if there are if a CNI defines 4 pod networks,
Mhm.
how do I know which one to target with ingressing traffic?
So this is what I was saying. We attach to a specific pod network. So gateway, as you said, select single network. That's how you select a single network. I select which
You're
network.
saying, see, I meant select a single external network.
Yeah, that's not. So that's what I, okay. So that's good that you bringing this up. This is where at least I would envision, and this is I am slightly because in Google we are kind of trying looking into some of this already on our side. But if you were to look at service itself, let's step back on the service itself. Can I really create a load balancer type service in front of? Probably we could in front of a pods that have multiple interfaces, right? Is there a point of that if I have a service pointing to a pod that has multiple interfaces and I select all those interfaces? What will that mean? I have one VIP. I cannot announce the same VIP on multiple, let's say, VLANs, right? That will be, you probably could, but that's kind of kind of tricky. And then debugging that's probably a nightmare to kind of to pinpoint, okay, from which network this really arrives and what's not. So and that introduces a lot of complexity.
How do you do service type load balancer then?
Say again.
How do you do service type load balancer if you can't determine if you have multiple interfaces?
Exactly. So for that reason, you would just assign to a specific network. So basically a service belongs, and this is what I was referring to gateway indirectly as well, belongs to a specific network. So it works within
so
that network.
Does that become a part of the service definition? You have to specify the pod.
That's what I would hope to eventually get to. Yes. If you don't specify it, you are within the default network, right? So the one that you do today. But if you want to assign to one of the other interfaces, then you specify that that network in which you want to do. Otherwise, let's say I have this, right? If I have a pod with the single interface, which is non-default, and I created a service for that pod, but I created a service in a default network, that service has no backends because that pod has no backends in that default network, endpoints in that network, right? So that will be the consequence of this, right? So basically you would have to create a service in that non-default network as well. And then, okay, now I know it's in that network. That means I'm in that VLAN, which already has some its own defined set of VIPs that I will assign to that service. My load balancer understands the multi-network concept, sets the VIP to that service, and then everything works within that VLAN, right? That's at least keeps it simple as you think of it. Because if we were to do more elaborate, that will make it so complex and so difficult to handle that probably nobody would want to have that. Because you see, I know the possibilities are there, and probably everyone would want to kind of mix and match things, but I don't think we will be able to kind of introduce that into Kubernetes because that makes it so much complex, right?
But introducing a change to the service definition seems like a big change.
And that's another thing. I agree with you, and we'll see where that goes. And as I said, this is our phase 3. If you look at our requirements doc, we kind of phased out all the requirements. Right now, we want to just define the API, and we'll see how that goes. Second phase doesn't even touch on that, on the services, on integration with other services yet. So second phase will be just hardening some of that APIs and dealing with some nodes. And then third phase, yes.
How can you do it at all without defining how it interacts with services? Like a pod network connects pods, but pods talk to each other via services, right?
That's I agree with you, but I think the services eventually, this is where I think the answer for this is because we cannot do everything at once, and that's gonna just blow up the scope, and we would never move. Okay. We have to do and make small steps because there is so much more things to this than that, so that we can talk about everything right away from the get-go. That's just, we would never move. That will be the issue here. We want to have something solid and move with phases so that we can then eventually get there. And then that's why we don't want to make this whole API a GA right away. It's gonna be unfortunately probably beta or alpha for a longer time when we have all the ducks in a row, everything is aligned, everything is set in stone. We don't need to change any APIs. Okay, then that's good. Then let's just now we can move on with the object going GA, because now finally we definitely not going to change that, because now we discussed all the kind of aspects of everything in Kubernetes, and now we can, okay, that's set in stone.
All right. I mean, we've run out of time. I guess
Yeah.
The main thing is I at this point, we probably don't need to say a whole bunch, do a whole bunch of coordinating between the gateway API with the egress and your work with the multiple pod networks. All right.
Right. And Philip, just one thing, just keep in mind to what we want to do in pod network. I think I gave you more or less like a gist where we are heading with the pod network. So from your point of view, what you're going to propose, the one thing I would ask from you is to keep us in the loop if you want to do some changes, or keep in mind what we are trying to do with pod network to what you want to do, so that we don't have to then compete on you know, in how it has to be kind of defined in the future between each other. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks everyone. Let's meet next week.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, bye now.